Good morning, all, and welcome to this week's Jump discussion. This week, we're kicking off a completely new series of webinars where we're going to talk about lots of things. This week, we're going to talk about international recruitment and why you should expand internationally. And I think it was quite a difficult one to start to dig stats out on, because obviously it's a difficult market and a difficult market to understand. So I've sort of dug deep to look at that. And thanks to the development of sort of new technologies, especially AI, and the improvements around telecommunications, the hiring volume is set to increase massively globally. And with the UK and the US, it's looking to rise by about 58%. So what I thought I'd do is I'd start to look at the percentages in certain countries around the world for their main markets that the UK agencies can operate in. So some of these facts have come from Google, so don't blame me for the facts, because I literally took them straight out of Google. But I want to look at their labour force numbers versus the number of recruitment agencies in the country to give you an idea of the saturation and the competition in the global markets, and why some of the why some agencies should start to look at this. So let's start to look at the increase of the labour marketplace. So India, they think their labour force marketplace is going to increase by 76%. Mexico was 67%, Southeast Asia 62%, France 50%, China 50%, and Brazil 40%. Germany, however, where lots of recruitment agencies are working, they're going to improve by 61%. They have a labour force of 41 million. Now, I couldn't find the number of agencies in Germany, but apparently it's not a great deal, as much as we would think. I went to the US and looked at the US. So the US is going to increase their labour force by 58%, and their labour force currently is at 164 million. Now, according to Google, they have 20,000, and that's only 20,000 recruitment agencies in the US, which is 0.01 agencies per worker. Australia has a 45% increase in employment. They have 12 million in their labour force, and according to Google, they have 7,000 agencies. So that's 0.05 agencies per worker. The UK, again, we said we're going to grow by 58%. We have a labour force of 29 million. Now, according to Google, we have 27,000 recruitment agencies. And this is where you can start to question Google on the number of agencies, because we think there's around about 40,000. But that's 0.09 agencies per worker. So what it says is the UK is the most saturated market in recruitment. The US is one of the least saturated market in recruitment, which potentially explains why lots of recruitment agencies in the UK go to the places like the States, Australia, and Germany. So there's genuine reasons why we should start to think about moving outside of the UK for certain marketplaces, and why UK agencies are probably a little bit more advanced due to the competition in the UK compared to the rest of the labour market, or the rest of the agency market, just say, across the globe. So this week, I'm joined by Paul Jacobs. He's come back from the fjords, and wherever he was the week after that, Bolton. Yes, he went from the fjords to Bolton. What could be more contrasting than the fjords to Bolton? But there you go. But he's back from the fjords and Bolton. And Heather's joining us again this week from there. So it'd be interesting to see their views of different side. Heather being an HR business that's worked with lots of agencies that are already working across the pond and across into Europe, etc. So first question then is, with the world economic cycle almost already in sync with each other due to the pandemic, why should you consider looking outside the UK for business?
Okay, so first and foremost, Howard, I think we're going to have to rename you Phileas Fogg, because it seems to me, based on your intro, that you've been around the world in about 80 seconds. So, I mean, I think you're going to be known as Foggy going forward.
I'm not sure if that's the last of the summer wine, Foggy.
Yeah, no, I think it was. Well, you live in that neck of the woods, in fairness, don't you? So,
three daft old men on a hill. Where does that describe us?
Yeah. Well, I think, it's a great question, and I speak to recruitment businesses very often about international expansion. The first thing, and I'm sure Heather's going to pick this up because she's worked with a business that was very much an international business, as I have in the past with Adecco. But I think the first thing to consider very strongly is to think cautiously, because although, as you've pointed out, Howard, there are perhaps fewer agencies per working individual elsewhere. Let's be clear about this. There are some very good recruitment businesses internationally. We do not have the exclusivity in the UK on good recruitment businesses. So, you need to think very hard about international expansion. We're going to come to this a bit later on. My view is that we do, as you've rightly said, we live in a very small world. Technology has enabled us, all of us, to work across borders. I do, you guys do, and it's pretty easy. We need to be looking at, and we'll come to this about legislation and so forth. It's definitely a possibility that wasn't a possibility in the past. Why would you do it? Well, I think it's got a great deal to do with two factors. Number one, the sector that you operate in. And the second factor is going to be based upon whether you can offer something that is an edge, if you like, above others in that market. Perhaps one other factor to consider is the fact that you should be seriously looking at whether your clients are interested in you helping them elsewhere around the world. And that's one of the big drivers when I talk to my clients. What do your clients want from you? And if it's possible for you to expand alongside their expansion, then absolutely that's something to consider very strongly.
I'm going to take a slightly different position, Mr. Jacobs, because it
That's
makes the
fine.
conversation a little bit more interesting.
I'm not sure. I have to leave now. I'm not sure.
I wouldn't be cautious about it. I'd say the world is shrinking. The pandemic has made it smaller. The world is your oyster. Go out and get it. The UK market is saturated, as Howard said. There are more recruitment businesses in the UK competing for the same amount of business than in any other country in the world. And there are an awful lot of countries out there that will welcome the skills and the expertise that UK-based specialists can bring. And, go for it. Howard alluded to the fact that I work for a business that expanded internationally. We went from being a purely UK-based recruitment group. 6-7 years later, after we made the decision to go internationally, we had offices in 24 locations overseas. We were operating in placing people in 70 different countries, and we did that in 6-7 years. So it's totally doable. You just have to have global ambition.
Okay. So I don't disagree with you. You'll be delighted to know. I mean, I'm all for expansion internationally, indeed anywhere in the UK and internationally. But I'll come back to a bit later on as to why I've suggested don't charge into it without doing proper research and making sure that
totally agree. And I think some of the questions that we're going to talk about are about barriers and how complicated it can be. But I think people sometimes are scared off. And actually there really is money to be made outside of the UK, and we sometimes can be a little bit blinkered that because we have such a long history of recruitment businesses working in this country, we're a little bit blinkered sometimes about the opportunities that exist elsewhere.
So I think my experience of this, if I went back to sort of the early 2000s, and at the moment we said the economic cycle of the world has all been brought into sync because of the pandemic. So everyone's at the same cycle and etc. But when it starts to fall out of sync again, which it will do reasonably quickly, then what you find is where some countries are booming, some countries are busting. I remember in this sort of early 2000s when the UK was going through a little bit of a bust time. We decided, it's Computer People, part of the Adecco group, as Paul knows, to open a European arm out of London. Now, obviously flying completely under the Adecco radar, so the rest of the Adecco world didn't realise that we were working outside the UK.
Recruiters flying under the radar.
Absolutely.
Outrageous behaviours.
Outrageous behaviours.
We
built a team very quickly of 20 and was very quickly billing into certain countries, so Germany, France, Switzerland, where what we found was that our skill set was so far in advance of other recruitment agencies that we were bringing candidates to those clients far quicker in a far more dynamic way, and we were starting to outperform their normal local recruitment agencies. We got caught by Adecco because one of our clients rang up the local Adecco office asking for us because they wanted to check our labour leasing licence, which the rest of Adecco then weren't very, very pleased when we had to hand over then sort of £1.5 million worth of business, which we'd built in about 12 months. So we weren't very pleased either. But it sort of showed that from scratch, if you have the right product and the right service and you do the right due diligence, you can move it very quickly into that
absolutely true. Completely right. Yeah.
And we found that the countries that were booming when we were sort of busting a little bit, we could make a huge impact on our own gross profit and our own net profit very, very quickly. So I think it's about sort of taking that step. And I'm a bit between both of you, cautiously and go straight in at it. But once you go, you have to go quickly and go right, because you can make an awful lot of money.
So you could say cautiously reckless.
Yes, absolutely. Yes. So it's like driving down a hill of a push bike. It's like driving down the hill of a push bike and taking my helmet off. That's what it's like. So the next question is, what's the biggest barrier then to working overseas?
Look, I think we kind of alluded to this point a moment ago. Firstly, I think you need to do your due diligence, and this was my cautionary note about being cautious. Sounds a bit odd, but do your due diligence. It's not something to just charge into. That was kind of what I was alluding to. Make sure that you're very confident that what you can do, and you point a moment ago how it's very valid. You guys knew at the time that what you could offer in terms of expertise and so forth was superior. You believed and you proved to what the local market could provide, your competitors could provide internationally. And I think this is part of it. Look at what you're up against, be clear about what the competition is and what the clients in those territories are seeking. It absolutely, to Heather's point, makes complete sense to be looking at underdeveloped markets, particularly as you demonstrate, Howard, where you can make a big impact. I made the point earlier that I think we often, and there are people listening right now who work with businesses that are international. Why not be working with them across borders in other territories? If you have the relationship and you're in a position to develop that cross-selling, upselling opportunity, why not? So the barriers, I think, are down to due diligence, making sure you do your homework, making sure that people are interested in working with you. But obviously, and maybe Heather will touch on this point, clearly legislation is varied across borders, and you're going to need a lot of professional support in terms of legal advice, finance advice and so forth. But you most certainly need to check that out. And on that note, I'll pass to Heather, who's had a lot of experience in that space.
Yeah, and I think that's absolutely it, Paul. It's understanding what is the legislative framework in the different countries you're operating in. And that can be as simple as having the capacity to bill in different currencies. So is that going to be possible? Understanding local tax, local withholding tax. How do you get money out of some countries? Are there some countries that you really shouldn't trade with? We would, once we said to recruitment consultants they could trade anywhere in the world, what they forget is that sometimes businesses are willing to give you business in particular countries because nobody else will trade with them there, right? And there are reasons why nobody else will trade with them there. So you do need to put some controls around it, and you do need to understand the countries that you're going to be able to get money out of and those that you aren't. And so there are definitely some barriers just around some of the practical stuff around it. Some countries, in some markets, there are licensing requirements. You've got to have a local business, and it does make a huge difference if you're doing temp or perm. Makes a massive difference to the framework. So I think understanding kind of legislative framework, financial restrictions and limits, taxation limits, those are the sorts of things that, as you say, Paul, you need professional expertise to understand.
You definitely do. You can't do this without that support.
Yeah.
I think that what we found, and going through the REC and going through APSCO, and I remember sort of with a company, we sent somebody out to Brazil to have a look at the Brazilian market, which was the next boom market as it was at the time due to their natural sort of commodities that they have. And we came back, and the comment was that, which absolutely sits with what Heather's been saying there, was the comment was, unless we start to go over there with large brown bags full of cash, then you will not be dealing very quick. And it was the same when we sent a delegation out to China, and it was you have to have a business in China for 5 years before you can start to trade in China. If you're an outside country, you can't flip it over from Hong Kong. And then the minister turned around. However, but if you go and speak to this guy in KPMG, he will get you a license within 24 hours. Which basically said, if you don't take this man with KPMG with large amounts of cash, they will get you a business license from there. But the big barriers, I think, is mainly from our cultural mindset, is time difference and that cultural barrier. What's the difference in culture? And that's what people tend to forget. There's a very difference in culture in certain countries. If you look at, say, Germany is very, very candidate shy and has been for a long time. And that's why the UK market really dominates in Germany, because we're good at finding candidates and really good at finding candidates, where the German market tends to be that sort of, they don't advertise they're looking for jobs, they don't advertise, they respond to job adverts as much as normal countries do, etc. But I think what you were saying there, Heather, the big one to me is that understanding that legislation and tax situation. So in a perm recruitment agency, it's fairly simple and fairly easy to look at, and there's little things that you can change to get that. But when you start to look at that contract market and temp market, you have to understand where your temp is from. If you've got an in situ temp, therefore the tax is inside where the country is going, it's again reasonably straightforward. But if you're bringing a temp in, let's say from a UK who works and lives in the UK and with a UK limited company, to say work in Switzerland, you're going to have some very interesting conversations about the tax situation and where the tax is paid and who's paying the tax.
The mobility issues around right to work, with moving people from country to country, but also how the other side of that is the license. Some countries need a license to operate in at all.
So if you go to Switzerland, you need to go through you need to have a business actually situated in Switzerland, which is 50% owned by a Swiss person. If not, then you need to go through a secondary party to get into. So there are ways to get in, but it's understanding those ways to get in from there. And sometimes you might be speaking to a client that doesn't understand that either, and just allows you to work, and then they will come chase you, because we're still part of the EU. So people like Switzerland, who isn't part of the EU but will capitalize on the EU law, will actually then come and chase you for your tax. But everywhere else in the UK, so you start to get chased from tax. So I think we've got to do that due diligence, because to me the big barriers are getting an understanding of the time difference, getting the cultural understanding of the country that you're actually going to be dealing with, but then making sure you are compliant to actually work, irrespective whether it's perm or temp or contract, and working from there. So let's flip that question. So what are the 3 key things that you need to be 100% certain of before entering an international market? And tax and legislation I'm going to take as a absolute must-have. So what are the 3 things do you think you need to be absolutely 100% certain of before entering an international market?
I mean, look, I think we've kind of alluded to these points, and that is that you need to be entirely sure that what you're going to offer is required. Because as I said at the beginning, we shouldn't be arrogant in our posturing when we think that, we can take services to other countries because nobody does what we do or does it as well. Make sure that what you are proposing to do is definitely something that is required and is sought after in those territories. And in many instances, that's absolutely the case. I think you need to think very hard about local representation. Can you work those markets from a UK base? Or do you need to be in the countries? Now, to some extent, as Howard, you just said, there may be an absolute legislative requirement that you have to have some kind of base in those countries. Elsewhere, perhaps that's not necessarily the case. And that really touches on your point about cultural alignment, making sure that not only is it a question of legislation, but it's a question of developing relationships in those countries along to talk to candidates, to talk to clients, making certain that you're speaking, as it were, not only the same language, but you're also aware of the cultural differences, so that you can start to build those relationships. I think those things become pretty important. One of the other things that I would add here is that you've got to look to see whether there is a flavour for doing this within your own business. So the fact that you as an owner may feel that that's something you would like to do is obviously an important issue, but you also need to make certain that the people that are going to support this expansion are up for it as well. And I had an instance of talking to, and I won't mention the name of the business, but it's pretty well known, the CEO of a business, an owner of a business, said to me that he was expanding into New York and America. And I said, oh, that's exciting. And he said, I don't think so. I don't actually want to do it. And I said, well, why are you doing it? On the premise that he owns about 80% of the shares. And he said, because I've built a brilliant management team and they want to do it. If I stand in their way, I may upset them to the degree they won't want to stay with me. So I'm allowing them to do it. And I think that's an interesting point. So make sure that you're aligned with your senior leadership team. And it may be that the senior leadership team are more interested than you are, but if that's something that's apparent, it's something to take into consideration. But in terms of making sure that you enter into those markets, ensure that there is an excitement in the business and a need that your clients are seeking to fill.
And I'd add to that is some clarity about what it is you're going after. So to quote a CEO in a very big business that I've worked for, people confuse the size of the opportunity with the ability to execute on the opportunity.
Yeah.
If you say to a recruitment consultant, hey, the world's your oyster, off you go, I'm now willing for you to work anywhere in the world. It's just the world is so big that, and so be very clear about which countries are you targeting. What are you targeting them with? Which market are you going after? What is it that you're trying to do? Are you trying to look at a saturated market, maybe that's a bit like the UK, but then we want a slice of it because we're going to do it better than anybody else? Or do we want to go into an expanding market? Do we, what is it we're going after? And be very clear. And it's the same as the way we exploit the UK market. It's that inch wide, mile deep, but be clear which is the inch of the world that you're going after. So if you just open up the whole world, you'll just confuse the people who work for you. So that clarity, I think, is really important.
So I need clarity from you, because in the first question you said the world is now a very small place, and now you've just told me the world's a very big place, Heather. So I'm now confused. Is it big? Is it small? From
I always thought the world is your lobster, isn't that the case?
That depends which restaurant you're eating in. But when we started to look, and I've taken a number of companies into foreign climes and worked in those international marketplaces, and I think what you talked about there is that due diligence to understand whether there's an appetite in that marketplace, and to take your inch wide and mile deep even further, Heather, was I always class this like my good lady's very good at sort of buying new tanning products, and rather than doing the usual thing, test a little bit to see whether it kills, she blathers it all on and also goes, oh my God, I've gone bright orange, I've done that, or I'm a strange colour, So I always think if you're going to go into a country,
she'd be delighted that you're sharing that little anecdote on the World Wide Web.
I will send her the video link.
I'm happy to post pictures of it. It's absolutely, it does make me laugh every time. Oh my God, I'm going to go darker. But anyway, it's just absolutely, I think when you start, I was talking to a client the other day, they were going into Germany, and I said, if you're going to go into Germany, do one thing. Rather than going to the whole of Germany, go into a city that is primary in your marketplace first, and develop that city, because in that city what you'll start to understand then is that cultural difference, how they do business, and then what you'll be able to do is then focus very, very definitely on a certain marketplace to see whether there is the appetite in that country to work with you, and how that you do business with them. And I think that's the first thing that I'd always say, because like you say, Heather, if you open it up to the whole world, then it just becomes a very, very messy place to be. So go in some very, very small, precise, focused environments, whether it be geographical or technical, and make sure that you can supply into that environment. I then think, as what you said, Paul, is that you have to have the appetite within the business to actually get there. And that's what we found. We started to try employ people that were, in one market in the UK, right, let's take you into a market in this country here. And they just didn't have the appetite. And so what we found was certain countries, their business language is English, and you can get away without having to speak their native tongue. However, some countries definitely want that native tongue.
Yes.
And therefore, what we found was in some areas, in Germany, you can get away with speaking English to most of your clients. In France, you couldn't. If you didn't speak French, they wouldn't potentially speak to you. What we found, though, in places like Holland, if you could speak Dutch, it gave you a massive leg up all of a sudden. So all of a sudden it was finding those little nuances within those countries that made it easier to deal with those countries. You could then start to look at, say, the Australian market and the American markets. It was then about putting people, do you have to put people in situ? So would be, do you have to build an office there, or could you run it from a timeline? And what we found was you could suddenly dual timeline certain things. So when we started to look at places like Singapore, we put people into Singapore because they were on the same timeline as Perth. And because they're on the same timeline as Perth, it's only a 4-hour timeline then to Sydney. So obviously it was very easy to do. You were talking about going into New York. I've got clients who are, it's too expensive to go into New York for real estate and for staff. So they've gone to Toronto because it's only a very short plane journey from Toronto into America. So to me, if you're certain to go into those markets, explore how you can exploit the market fully without having to pay the full market cost, because sometimes you don't have to. And there are lots of companies that have just got a UK base and are operating globally very well.
I was going to say,
Absolutely.
it's totally possible to serve the whole world from the UK. You don't need, except in certain countries.
Yeah, so what I'm saying is that,
but the vast majority you can do from the UK without putting anybody overseas.
To me, those three key things are: make sure you understand the cultural difference between how they do business and how you do business, and then make sure that you absolutely understand that you have an appetite in your business to do that, and then understand the markets that you're going in and start small and work out rather than go large and not particularly then take any market whatsoever.
Yeah.
So the question is, if you're going to make that transition, how do you make that transition into an overseas market easier?
Well, go on. Sorry, you had the first.
Sorry, the biggest one for me is look at your current clients. So who are you working with in the UK now that you can piggyback on?
Yes.
So if you've got a good relationship with a company in this country that already operate overseas, they will be your gateway into the overseas market. So first of all, look at your existing client base and have a look and see who you've got that you can piggyback where in the world. And then it's looking at your candidates for the same sorts of things. Have you already got candidates who've got experience in working in countries overseas, or have you got employees who have other languages or have lived in different countries overseas? So it's what knowledge have you got already without having to go out and do any research that you can exploit?
I think you took the words completely out of my mouth, and I completely agree with what you've just said. I mean, we often talk to people about the old Pareto's law thing about 78% of your business comes from 20 to 30% of your existing clients. This is very true in this particular instance. So get close to your clients, figure out, as I said it earlier, are they abroad? Are they in an international business? And then develop your relationship with that organization to the extent that you get to a stage where you can start discussing helping them across borders. And in fact, when I think back, and Howard made this point earlier, I think back to my days as being a board director at Adecco. A lot of the very large corporations that we shared internationally, if you were to go back and understand how it came to be that we worked with these very large international businesses cross-border, you will have found somewhere in dim distant past a relationship that began in a specific country, and that individual within Adecco developing that relationship to the extent that the business developed internationally. So I think it's a great point you make, Heather. Just look at who you work with already. Do the easy things first. Go and talk to customers who are already based internationally and establish what their needs are beyond our own shores. And it's at that point that you can start to consider doing something with them elsewhere. I made that point right at the very beginning. Don't just ad hoc go, we fancy working in Germany. Do your homework, but start from the perspective of, have I got clients already working in Germany? How would they be interested in me helping them elsewhere? The answer to that question, by the way, is often yes. So go and find that out, figure it out. We talk a lot about in these webinars, RPOs, mini RPOs, master vendor agreements, and so forth. That's the positioning that you want to take in order to explore whether they'd be interested in you assisting them somewhere else. So I think you make a great point, Heather, and I agree completely with that.
I think that's one of the reasons why when I was at CP, we set up that European division. It was purely because we had so many clients that had offices all across Europe. And we started to push and they started to say, can you help this office? Can you help this office? Because they weren't getting the help locally. And that's what springboarded us into that marketplace. And I think that easy transition then is using that. But then the bigger side of it is using your knowledge of the candidate marketplace. And that's using things like LinkedIn, using Zing and products like that, where you can start to understand the candidate marketplace. Because what we tend to find is the UK is very cutthroat from a recruitment point of view in certain places.
No.
But across the Europe, it's maybe not as cutthroat. And in certain markets, your candidates are very loyal. And once you get a really good candidate base and they are loyal to you, you can take that candidate to marketplace and start to really open some really major doors rather quickly. Because once the candidates trust you, then clients will start to trust you as well. So to me, it was using that your own clients to get you in there, but then using the candidate marketplace. Now, the marketplace has changed from a candidate's point of view, that the marketplace could be almost global for lots of companies. So again, if you've got a really good marketplace in the UK of candidates and they're willing and quite happy to work on global opportunities, but working from home, etc., then now you can start to really open a marketplace. And that's when you start to see that difference, that if you can take product to clients, and this is what we found, if we were taking the product to the client, as well as taking a recommendation from other people, it didn't just open the door, it flung them open and kept them open. Our job was then to close the door and stop the competition still coming through that. But that's what we did. We learned lots of things, though, by doing that. So here's the question. What's the biggest mistakes, the most common mistakes that recruitment agencies make when they start working overseas?
Well, I'd answer this by saying, be sure you have the capacity to do it. Because, I mean, when you look at the UK market, for example, are you at a point where you genuinely feel that you have the resources within your business to go beyond your own borders? Are you maxing out or doing your level best to max out in the UK? Is it the case now that you feel that there is a great opportunity for you internationally? Or are you jumping ahead of yourself? Perhaps you should be placing your energies into developing your own home market share, perhaps to a greater extent. So the answer to the question, I think, is be very careful that you don't stretch your resources so thinly that you can no longer cope. Make sure your infrastructure is strong enough and your external advisors are in place before you go abroad. And you're right, Howard, if you are going to do that, then dip your toe in the water, as it were, by trying to working alongside clients in order to ensure that you understand those markets before you go full on. But I think it comes down to establishing whether you have the resources, whether you have the appetite within the business to do it, whether you genuinely feel you wish to place your resources outside of your own shores, or whether you might be better off to utilize those resources to continue to develop your own market share within your own home market. These are all questions that are hard to answer on a webinar. They're very customized and individual to each business, but these are certainly things to think very hard about before you venture forth.
Yeah, and if you make that decision that you want to go, don't assume that you've got to learn all this stuff from scratch. You know, there are people out there who have done this before.
Yeah.
You know, use those skills around you to be able to do this. There are great outsourcing businesses who are used to dealing with recruitment businesses in different parts of the world. It's unusual for outsourcing businesses to only have UK clients.
Yes,
so they'll
true.
already be dealing with recruiters in different countries. What can your outsourcers provide you? Legal advisors, partnerships, payroll companies, local professional employer organizations. There are loads of people doing this already. There are associations with information about, you know, like the Staffing Industry Association. It's great at international knowledge and understanding. You leverage all of those things so that you're treading a path that someone else has already trodden, rather than necessarily trying to create a brand new path, and learn from those experiences, I think, and, you know, use those resources.
I think, to me, you're right in all of those things. And I think one of the biggest mistakes that I think I've come across, which lots of recruitment agencies do, is the way that they deal with the transaction of money between that country and back into the UK.
Yeah.
And I was
Seen that
appalled.
come horribly unstuck.
I was appalled at the amount of companies that said, yes, I invoice in whatever sterling, whatever denomination it is, and they pay straight back into my sterling account, and that my bank then charged me a large fee for converting that denomination into my sterling account. And to me, then, if you're setting a bank account and you're going to let's say you're going to Europe, set up a euro bank account. If you're going to the States, set up a dollar bank account. If you're going to Australia, set up an Aussie dollar bank account. Because when they transfer that bank money into the account, then it stays in that denomination. And then use the FX facilities. It's like the old, I'm hoping most people on this call are old enough to remember travelers' checks. You would never go buy your money from the bank because it cost you an absolute fortune. You'd go buy it from an FX, such as your travel agent, and you get a traveller's check, and you get more bang for your buck. It's exactly the same. And I worked with one company that was dealing purely with the States, and they'd been with the States for about 8 years. And when they worked out how much money they had lost, it was well in the excess of 6 figures that they had lost on just the pure conversion rate.
Yeah.
And so playing the money market sometimes is important, because if you can keep that money in a certain bank account and you can see it's going up or it's dropping, you can choose when to actually transfer the money and make more profit from it.
And most of the big banks, Howard, will offer you a euro account, a dollar account. You don't have to have a different bank, like an American bank, to get a dollar account. You'll be able to get one.
But what you've got to remember, and I explained this to one client, so they opened a euro bank account and then was taking the euros and putting it straight into their sterling bank account, and not realizing they're getting charged the same bank fee. So that's no, send it to an FX who will buy the money, and then they'll send it back into your sterling account. So use those external facilities, because they cost you far less, when transferring that money. And it is a real, interesting one when you start to think about you're paying all the costs that come with that, including commission. But if you're losing 5% of your deal because of a currency transaction, that's a big percentage to be losing, but you're still paying everything else on it. So make sure that you understand the currency transaction and understand how you can make more money from that currency transaction than normal. That's the things that I would be looking at.
Yeah, good point.
Here's a question then. If recession comes, why is having an overseas business beneficial to your business?
I think in many respects it's self-explanatory. I mean, you're spreading the risk. Look, I do think one thing worth making a point about here is that recessions, because we talked earlier about the world is a small place, tend to be rather global these days. I mean, you can see that when you read the media commentary at the moment about what's going on in the world in terms of economics. It's not just the UK that's experiencing inflation. It's not just the UK that are experiencing rising employment opportunities and so forth. These things are all interlinked. Everybody is linked with somebody now in the world. So I think you need to be just mindful that it's not as polarized as it used to be in the past. But I would also add that clearly having businesses in different territories spreads the risk. And particularly going back to the earlier point, if you're doing your homework before you're going into these markets and you're aware of booming opportunities, booming markets, opportunities to really expand very quickly in those territories, because for whatever reason, their economics are different, their situations are different, then clearly having overseas opportunities is likely to help you balance the books and will provide you with a level of protection. You could argue the opposite, and you could argue clearly that if you put all of your eggs, as it were, overseas, or most of yours overseas, and that market drops, then you've got the same problem in reverse. So I think it's about making sure the balance is correct. But I would absolutely suggest that clearly if you're reaching abroad, working abroad, then that is likely to provide you with greater protection in the event of, let's say, the UK market having a particularly tough time.
Nothing to add to that. Absolutely agree, Paul. It's about hedging.
Do you record that? This is recorded, isn't it, Howard?
Yes, it is recorded that I have agreed with you publicly.
And I'm very
What I was just about to say, Heather, is that mine and your bits are recorded. Paul's are just not recorded.
You know, edited out.
Yeah, fair enough. Yeah, fair enough.
No, I think when we talk about recession, when recession comes, and this is the bit that why in 2003, I think it was 2004, that we went into the European market, is because the world is, as I said, it's now all synced on an economic cycle, but it will soon fall out of sync. And it's capitalizing. So you are sort of inverted commas recession proofing your business.
Yeah.
However, you've got to think then as countries, like we think of clients, if you've got all your pot in one country, then you are sort of putting your company at risk. Same as if you had all your revenue coming from one client. So you've got to start to then spread. If you are going to go into the overseas markets, you think about how you then spread that risk across the overseas market. And I think the benefit then comes that you can then start to sort of be a little bit quicker at flipping from one area to another and put your focus into a certain area where you know that that's on the up. But you can also then start to track where the other countries are and start to look where you should be moving to and what's going on. And so you can start to follow the economic cycle around the globe and start to capitalize on that cycle. There are certain countries that are, very much on their own. So Australia is very much an economy on its own that isn't really hit very much by the world economy, except in certain areas. And then you start to think that the States is hit huge by the world economy because of its import and export from all over the place. And so you start to think about different countries that will be affected from elsewhere. So we start to think about what's happening in the Ukraine. No one ever thought of the Ukraine being absolutely pivotal to the rest of the world until you suddenly realize from a UK point of view, we get something like 30% of all our fertilizer comes from the Ukraine, 30% of our building material comes from the Ukraine, etc., etc., etc. So certain countries having problems has a knock-on effect all the way through that process. So I think when recession comes, you've got to think about what areas going into recession, but then what's the knock-on effect for the rest of the marketplace, because you might chase into a marketplace that may be affected by that recession as a subset from that. So always look beyond that. Where does that country get its business from? What's its import export look like, to ensure that you're not putting yourself into a position of weakness rather than to a position of strength. So the final question then, and this is a question I get an awful lot, okay? So besides the language barrier, what are the differences of working an overseas market to the UK market?
We've kind of
It's
a great question. I mean, we've touched on a lot of this. I mean, clearly, let's list them: cultural differences, legislative differences, financial rigor, obviously currency. You make a point about that, Howard. I think you're going to look at mobility, technology, skills shortages or surpluses, and so forth. I mean, it's just completely different, and you can't view it as anywhere near, it doesn't matter which market you're talking about, even the closest markets in Europe are significantly different in all sorts of ways and with nuances. Don't forget, let's be really clear. Let's keep it simplified here. Quite aside from the more complicated issues we've been talking about, recruitment is all about, and always has been, people buying people. It's about relationships, building relationships. So aside from all of the technical things we've been talking about, you really need to think about building local relationships. And that's a very important, or rather ephemeral, but rather important subject matter. And if your business is all about, and most businesses are, building relationships, and you put building client and candidate relationships in the center of everything you do, that needs to be thought through very carefully when you think through going into an external market outside of the UK.
Yeah, and if I can just add in a couple of specifics as well, because I'm really conscious of how much time we've got left, which is none. So America, massive market, massive opportunity. We think we don't have a language barrier. We do, right? They don't. American and English are really different, so it's totally overcomable, if that's even a word. But
that's an American word I've never heard of.
but genuinely, it's a very different language. So so there is stuff to be learned on that. Is an interesting one. Culturally, in Germany, Yeah, we haven't. One of the issues we have in this country is candidates dropping out. Yeah, we lose candidates before they get into the job. You don't really get that in Germany. If a candidate says he's going to start a job, he starts the job, or she starts the job. That's a cultural difference that we don't always understand, that you have to think about and know about. And the other biggie for me, if we're talking about specifics, is Australia. Great market, as Howard said, tends to be a little bit recession proof. Fantastic, speak the same language. It's cool, but the fact that they're the diametrically opposed time zone makes it incredibly difficult to do business with Australia from the UK. So they are very specific examples of differences. It's all possible to overcome, but it's just being aware that cultural, language, time zones specifically can cause you.
So talking that specific thing in Germany about the lack of dropouts, I ran a German business for 4 years. We had one dropout in 4 years, and he was so ashamed of dropping out, he actually replaced himself in the business, and the business still paid us the fee.
Yeah, I can believe that absolutely, Howard. It was one of the things we were most surprised about when we opened our German offices, was the behaviour of candidates was totally different. And it's interesting because I don't know how much it's linked to the fact that you also in Germany don't have the sort of sales culture that we have in recruitment. Well, we see it as a sales job culturally, and so employing staff in Germany was very different as well.
Yeah.
Well, I was going to say the big difference that I found, and this is the key differentiation that I found, is that recruiters in the UK aren't treated particularly very well by our clients, and I keep talking about this prospect to suspect relationship that we have. However, what I found in the States, in Europe, Australia, recruiters are treated very, very differently. They are treated as an added value to their business, and therefore we're treated in a lot different way. Rates were a lot higher, fees were a lot higher. People very seldom quibbled about them. Therefore, selling retained business, selling higher fee business was an awful lot easier because they saw the value in what recruitment actually brought to the company. Where in the UK, because we are so saturated and everyone's competing against each other, clients don't see the value. And I think that was the key difference that I found, that I was treated with a very air of respect rather than with an air of caution, which I think some of the clients treat us like over here. So I think that's one of the key differences that you start to see, understand when you start to look at the overseas marketplace, that if you go in with a really high professional service, you'll be treated like a professional services company rather than treated like a recruitment agency is in the UK. Yeah. So I think the big difference is get your services right and get them driven, because that's really important. Yeah. And talking services next week, that's exactly what we're going to talk about. Next week, we're going to talk about candidate services. We know the candidate is king. So how do we stand out or stand up to poor recruitment practices to make sure our candidates get a far better journey through the recruitment process and through the recruitment life cycle? We will be asking questions like, are you obscure to your candidate marketplace? And we know the answer simply and flippantly is yes. So how do we change that? So we're going to talk about an awful lot of things next week about the candidate service. The week after, we're going to talk about client services. So we're going to sort of talk about both of those things. So we've got a big 2 weeks coming up. As you see now on our PowerPoint presentation, the bottom left-hand corner, we now do have a QR code. So if you want to leave us a Google review, please leave us a Google review. Just scan it with your phone and tap on with it. Heather's done it because she's technology advanced. Paul is still struggled out.
Just a second, figured it out actually.
Oh, he's figured it out. He's figured it out. It's taken him an hour to figure out, but well done. He's finally figured it out. He's done it now. Yes, so he's done it. So if you want to leave us a Google review, please leave us a Google review. That all just leaves to say thank you very much for attending. Enjoy your bank holiday weekend. It's a long weekend, so enjoy it whatever you're doing. Paul and Heather, thanks for your time, and we'll see you all next week.
Take care, everybody. Enjoy the Jubilee. Enjoy. See you, everybody. Bye now.